very special edition of the Speakers Forge. Today we kick off our Dariel Conference. This is the first session in a series of sessions that will continue well into 2020. It is built by Dariel, for Dariel, and our external friends, and it is centered around our values, everything that's in our DNA. We are extremely excited to share this with you. The talks cover technical content and non-technical content. They span personal growth and really interesting technologies. It is meant to serve our biggest software development community and also highlight a little bit of what we've learned in 20 years as a software development company. This video was done in post, so I do apologize that this is editing-ing and not live-ing. The first session unfortunately had a couple of technical gremlins, which we do apologize for. The content is still superb, and I am so excited to introduce the two talks. Moyo is an intermediate developer with Dariel, and he's going to share with us a little bit more about Blazor and why he believes it is the future. The second talk is done by our very own James McGillivray. It was presented internationally at SQL Saturday and SQL Bits and covers data stories that would make the Bard proud. So if you want to know a little bit more, keep posted, tune in, and we will also be sharing this as we continue. The next session will be on the 25th of November of 2020. It's a Wednesday in your lunch break, so join us in there. It's going to be one for the books, and it's going to cover innovation and magic. But without further ado, let's go and hear all about Blazor and some really cool data stories. See you guys soon. Goodbye for now.
You are live.
Guys, so today I am just gonna be talking about Blazor. I am author, as Annie mentioned. So yeah, I guess we might as well just get into it, and I'll tell you more about myself whilst we are presenting, right? Let's just see. All right, so first things first, we're going to be talking about Blazor today. So Blazor is what I regard as the future. So the reason why I say that is that this is like my third year as a software development, as a software engineer. So I have been going around trying to see which sort of like frameworks are going to last longer than the other ones and stuff like that. So today, just give me the opportunity just to talk about Blazor. All right. So the question which you might have is, what is Blazor? All right. So Blazor is a framework for building interactive client web UIs with the .NET framework. As everybody knows, that like the .NET framework has been built by Microsoft as its platform, or as a way of people can actually build apps through their full stack, right? So what Blazor is, Blazor allows us to create rich interactive UIs using C# instead of JavaScript. So mainly most of like the front end applications are built off like JavaScript, and Blazor is a way in which we can now move away from using JavaScript, and we can actually just use C# as a stack. Okay, so what Blazor is, it's based on components. So a component in Blazor is an element of which it can be a page, a dialog, or a data entry form. So on the little snippet underneath, you can see like some block of code where it's just a button. So that's just a component which is written in C# and HTML. So that type of markup page is called Razor. So essentially, that's how we build and build our Blazor applications. So the question which you might have is, why should you be choosing Blazor over any other framework, right? So Blazor is a good single-page application for front-end development, which just uses C# as a full stack. So you're building all your back-end and your front-end code using C#, which is ideal in an environment where you do not have a lot of JavaScript developers. So we can write our front-end application C# and without depending on JavaScript, as we'll typically do with React, jQuery, or Angular, because Blazor will take place in all of that. So essentially, we don't need to have a separate team running front-end, which is just purely front-end, and another team just running C# or Java at the back end. Blazor just encompasses everything and it just runs it as it is. All right. So what Blazor does is it implements the .NET standard, which enables Blazor projects to reference libraries that conform to the .NET standards specifications. So .NET standard classes can be shared across all .NET platforms such as Blazor, .NET Core, .NET Framework, Xamarin, Mono, and Unity. So essentially what we have is just build once and publish on many. So that's ideal in situations where you really have like a small team and you want to share your code across everything. All right. So when we're building Blazor applications, you'll be asking yourself, are we stuck in like the whole Microsoft ecosystem and everything? But like what we can do is Blazor has got different hosting, app hosting, different app hosting. So what it does is Blazor is designed to run either in the browser, on WebAssembly, and also run on the server side as Blazor server. So essentially what these two hosting models are is that like one runs entirely on like the client side and one runs entirely on the server side, depending on what your application needs and what you need. So we're just going to dive into what exactly Blazor server apps are. So in this model, the Blazor applications run on the server on top of a full .NET Core runtime. Okay. When the server loads the application, a small JavaScript is downloaded and established a two-way signal or communication with the server. Any interaction that like the user has with the application, be it a button click or any event which happens on the browser side, is transmitted back to the server, and the server processes that interaction. So after the server is done, any updates which have to be done or any information which has to be sent back to the client, the server now sends it back via Signal R. So with every hosting, with every application, there are the good and the bad. So some of the benefits which come with the server, Blazor server, is that like it runs on full .NET Core runtime. Like the development for these applications are very fast. So we have quick applications just being taken out because we are building once just for the server. We don't have to worry about the front end because we are already encompassing that in our Blazor application, and all your code is kept on the server side and is not downloaded to the client. So the only way, so our application has got like a layer of security by it being on the server side, okay? But also with every application, there's some drawbacks to it. So the major drawback with this is that like it does not work in high latency environments. So we have areas where in South Africa they do not have constant internet connections and stuff like that. So in those areas, you might find that like this won't be an ideal way to build your application. And this And this type of hosting model also does not have any offline support since it requires a constant communication with the server. And one also major drawback is that like it's heavy resource intensive on the server. So we might find that like your server might have deadlocks and stuff like that, which really might accumulate the bill if you are running on the cloud, which we are driving as Dariel. Okay, so you might be asking like, okay, so with all these benefits and drawbacks, what would be a good use of a Blazor server-side application? So a Blazor server-side can be used in a lot of scenarios, but it is ideal for internet applications or low demand public facing applications. So if you have an application that like someone just uses once in a blue moon, just to, let's say, log a ticket or do something, you do not have like, so you can use this type of hosting model for that. So where you also want to have like you want to do like a POC for a project, and the client is really eager, you can just say, okay, we can build you something with like a Blazor server, and you can just push all the code and everything just works with the Blazor applications, Blazor server side. So we're gonna dive into now like the Blazor WebAssembly. So Blazor WebAssembly apps execute directly in the browser on a WebAssembly.NET runtime. So Blazor WebAssembly function in a similar way with JavaScript frameworks like Angular and React. So how this happens is that like the Blazor application which we're building, after we're done publishing and deploying it, the client is now interacting it. So there is an initial download where the client gets the application. So that also now comes in with like the .NET runtime and the application assembly also onto the client side, and that's hosted on the browser. So now what that does, so the client can now interact with the application just on the browser, and it can be talking to the server via either API or just via Signal R if you want, depending on how you have modeled out your application. So also this hosting model helps us to have a situation where we can have like a progressive web app for many applications. So if you want to just have like a sort of mobile application on it, you can just install it, and it's just one button click and you have a progressive web app. So we also now need to talk about the good and the bad about this hosting, this Blazor hosting model. So one of the major benefits is that like everything is compiled and is a static file. There's no need for you to have .NET runtime on your server. This can be hosted anywhere, and all the work is offloaded from the server to the client, since the client downloads all the files they need, and the app works on the client side. So apps can also run in like an offline state. So you can have offline where you can also just have like progressive web apps, and it also has like that code sharing between the server and the client side for easy communication to map models and stuff like that. So one of the major drawbacks with this is that like the load time, the initial load time with a Blazor WebAssembly is very large. So you have a huge download side. So if you're in an area where there is no connection, like a poor connection, you might experience like terrible load times. And also the major drawback with that is that like you might be all the apps are running in like the browser's sandbox, so you have restrictions, security restrictions, just like any other JavaScript application, which shouldn't be much of a deal, because if you were going to build an Angular app, you're still going to have the same restrictions. So now we might be asking like, okay, we have these two models. where can we use the WebAssembly? Because they do sound like they're similar. So WebAssembly is built to be a direct competitor to any modern JavaScript framework, be it React, be it Vue, be it Angular. So if you wanna, if your team is having to discuss, okay, what are we gonna build for which service are we gonna use, or which framework are we gonna use to build our front end, we can just consider Blazor, because if you have a team where you do not have experience with JavaScript or any other framework, you might, and you have people who have skills in C#, you can use Blazor as one major, you can have one major, just have full stack of just C# clients there. All right, then one more thing that like we might have to just consider when we're building like Blazor applications is there are like a lot of third-party JavaScript libraries that like you might want to use within your applications. It might be 3D rendering and stuff like that. So you might be asking yourself, how do we now communicate this? Because since this is C# code which is running, all right? So for that, Blazor is able to communicate with a lot of JavaScript APIs. So in that, you can now build your application to communicate with the JavaScript, and the JavaScript can also communicate back with the C# code. So it's sort of like it's happy with either one of the two being run in the same application. All right. So now I've been talking a lot, and I think I might just give you a small demo on it. So if you were to run like just if you want to play around with Blazor and you want to build like a WebAssembly or server project, I have put in some few codes where you can just run it on VS Code or any text editor, which as long as you have the .NET runtime on your application or on your PC, you're good to go and you can start playing around with Blazor. All right. So I'm just going to showcase everything on my. I'm just going to showcase. Stuff on my desktop so that I can see how we can run. How we can run our applications. So as I was talking, what we're going to build today is just a simple component which calculates tax. All right. So I have already done most of the heavy lifting for you guys. So I'm just going to show you this project structure. So we have your www root with like a normal application. And we have our pages. So these are our Razor component pages, and all of them they just hosted and all have like a .NET .Razor extension, and this is our application. So we are just going to build just a simple refund tax calculator. So what it does is just you click a button, then it tells you randomly how much you're going to get as your tax refund. So the beauty about this is that like this code, the calculations and everything is now in a totally different project, and everything through dependency injection, it calculates our tax refund and it sends it back to our DOM. Okay, so I've already have the application running. So initially when you
but you are sharing the wrong screen. You need to just share your actual app. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was.
No, it's cool. Thanks, guys. Let's see.
Just give me a second. There you go. Just let me know if you can see it. Nope.
Not as yet. Hold on.
Okay. Let's just try again. Just. Okay, just going to show you guys the app itself. So essentially what I was talking about, what I was talking about is we have this is like the default Blazor application which you have. So everything is a single page. So everything is running on the front end and everything. So what we have here is just a hello world, and I think you guys did not see you guys didn't see the screen itself. So I'm just going to stop sharing and I'm going to show you just that. All right, so now for this, we're just going to see, so I'm just going to show you this product structure, right? So I'm going to show you guys again. So it's just the hosting and everything. So this is just basic HTML, which is in the Razor, and we are building what we call like our text return application, right? So here we are just going to click a button, then it gives us a refund, goes and calculates the refund, then it comes back and updates the front end, right? So what all that code where we are now having to go and click on it and it brings back the annual return, all that is in a different project. And the beauty about this is that like whatever you build, like all your business logic and everything can be separated into like your services can be separated and your front end can directly communicate with your services. You do not need like an API or anything with it. So now also with this, with Blazor, like one of the major reasons why I was saying that like it's the future is that like with the same functionality where you have your Razor Pay or your Razor Pages, you actually now have the same functionality on your Xamarin application. So down here, I'm just going to expand this. So down here, this is actually just a typical Xamarin Forms application where you have your Android version and your Xamarin Forms application. So I've already created a similar text return application. When you click on it, it showcases just the same XAML mixed with Blazor code. So this is like one of the major drives to why Blazor is going to be the future, because you can now build your native applications alongside your front end using one stack instead of having to separate between having to choose Angular and you have to go to Flutter or any other application. So all this can be just done with just one framework. So with the same functionality, you can see that like on the hello world, we do have like the let's calculate text return, and when you click on it, it calculates your text return, and it's using the same code which the front end or like our Blazor application was using. So I hope I've confused you guys to really consider using Blazor in most of your applications. Upcoming, if you have any questions, just drop it in the Q&A and I will answer it at the end of this. All right.
Awesome.
Back to you.
Awesome stuff. Thank you so much, guys. This was awesome. I see we have a couple of questions and comments that have come through. So if there's anything burning, pop it in there. And without further ado, we're going to hand over to James and we're going to hear all about data stories and making the bard proud, which is kind of what we all want to do. So James, over to you. Right.
You got me. Hey.
Yes, we got you.
Right. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for being here for this talk. I have to apologize. Firstly, I thought I'd be really clever and book the Four Seasons Hotel to be my background when I was talking, but unfortunately, I booked a Four Seasons pizza instead. So, well, I'm just going to have to eat that later. Anyway, that's not why we're here. My name is James. I'm sure most of you know me. Well, I hope most of you know me. And we are going to be talking about data storytelling in this session. So let's switch to a different view, maybe that view. There we go. Sorry, I have a. Why do we tell stories? And this is basically where I start this session. So the reason we tell stories with data is for people to get a take-home message and to not be overwhelmed by the volume of data we're producing. Because when people create an emotional connection with stories rather than with a spreadsheet or a table full of data. And that's basically what we're going to look at through this session. That's where we're going to go. And you may be asking yourself, why do I care about data storytelling or even data as a whole? I'm not a BI developer. I'm not creating reports. I'm not doing anything that might be considered data storytelling. But actually, all of us have to be able to do this. All of us, it's becoming a larger and larger part of all of our careers, talking through data, being able to present data in a way that makes meaningful connections, being able to present data in an ethical and honest way, being able to communicate with data or using data when we're talking to people. So this is a vital skill. This is something that you've probably seen on Facebook. You've seen little stories, data stories that immediately create a connection with you on Twitter, even in the news, in broadcasting and journalism. This is becoming a more sought after skill, and it's something we should be able to do. So there are three key elements to any data story. The first one is obviously data. You can't tell a data story without data. The second one is the visuals, the way you present that data. So sometimes your data story might be, you may be able to present it in a table, but we'll look at how to create better tables and how to do things like that. You may want to create it in charts or visuals or other ways. You may want to write a paragraph that has some sort of data focus that is still a data story. So we'll look at all the different ways that we can actually present that data, the visual representation. And then the third thing is the narrative. So our narrative is actually the story. And all three of these elements need to work together. We can't have one or two of them, otherwise we don't have a story, we just have something else. So if we take the first two, just data and visuals, without any narrative, we are basically enlightening our audience. We are giving them something that they can use, but we're not necessarily making a connection. If we have data and a narrative, well, then I am sort of telling you a story, but I'm not likely to get you to remember it because I'm really explaining what my data says without giving you something visual to focus on. And if I don't have any data, I can have visuals and a narrative, but really that's not doing anything. There's no substance to that. So the golden point, or where we really want to be, is to have the combination of all three of these: data that we understand and that we're familiar with, visuals that communicate the story of the data clearly, and a narrative that ties it all together, creates an emotional connection with our audience, and allows us to move forward. Okay, so in this session, what are we going to do? What are we going to talk about? And then how are we going to try and get some take-home lessons? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to explore a data set that I've got for the purposes of this demo. We are going to just get a bit familiar with it, because you will see that just by exploring data, we can start to grow a familiar and sort of, we can start to imagine the kind of questions we're going to ask. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start exploring some stories. So most of this will be in Power BI, but these skills are not Power BI related. We're not going to focus much on actually how to do anything in Power BI. We're talking about techniques here. And then the last one is we're going to just go back and explain the choices we've made repeatedly so that we know that we're actually consciously thinking about what we're doing. These are not arbitrary design choices. These are not arbitrary sort of decisions. They are well thought out, clear decisions that we can work through. Okay, so let's start. I'm just going to turn on my camera so that you get a small portion of my face. Okay, so let's start. The first thing is this little slide is taken from a book called Storytelling with Data, which is by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflick. She was the head of data communications at Google for quite a long time. And she's recently gone independent, and now she does mainly training. But she's a really phenomenal author. And if anyone's more interested in this, in the things that I'm going to talk about today, this is a wonderful starting point and a lovely place to really get your teeth into it. She has a very, very nice style of writing. It's an easy read, and you can get through it very easily. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we need to do to build a good story. The first thing is we need to understand context. And this is critical. This is actually really, really important. If you don't understand the context in which your data resides, whatever data it is, you're never going to be able to create a compelling narrative. You're never going to be able to create something that forms an emotional connection with the people who are the consumers of this data. So it's critical for us to understand context. The next thing is that we choose the right visuals. And we're going to have a little section where we talk about visuals, but as a rule of thumb, or what I generally say here, is that simpler is better. People know simple visuals are simple because lots of people know how to use them. So lots of bar charts, lots of line graphs, lots of cards that just have single figures on them, and you don't have to be investing in incredible graphic designers or people who know all these fancy types of charts to get this stuff done. You can actually do it with very simple graphical devices and visuals. Okay, then we're going to have a quick section on cleaning up visuals and data, how to make them more clear, how to get rid of clutter. And in her book, she talks about decluttering and the golden idea of a data to ink ratio, whereas everything on your graph or on your chart should be contributing to the meaning of the visual. You don't need extraneous things like unnecessary legends, unnecessary axes and grid lines, all those kinds of things. So we'll look at a couple of those examples. Then we're going to talk about pre-attentive attributes and how we can leverage a bit of psychology and sociology in the way we present our data and how we can make that make our stories more compelling by recognizing that. And then the last thing is, how do we put it all together and how do we actually tell the story? How do we communicate it? How do we actually get that out to an audience? So this is, I think, the only slide that is specific to Power BI. So I will quickly go through it. And these are just some of the devices that we can use in Power BI to help us tell good stories. Things like bookmarks, where we can save our filters and save the exact sets of data that we want someone to look at. Things like buttons, where I can hide or show things depending on the use case. Drilling through and allowing people to see extra data, etc., etc. All of these are ways that we can tell more interesting stories, but some of them are also ways that we can declutter our reports by not, for instance, trying to show too much data. That's why we allow a drill through or a tooltip that can highlight a specific data point and bring back more data about that. And we will definitely have an example of that just now. Okay, so the first thing we need to just talk about in terms of how to tell a story, and I know this was the last step, but it all kind of ties together. So how to tell a story is something called the narrative arc. Now, the narrative arc is actually a theatrical or creative writing device. It is the flow of a story. Any story basically follows this pattern. And you'll probably start to recognize it in that we have the exposition. What is the exposition? Well, basically, we're giving some background information. This is how things stand right now, or this is how the situation is developing. You know, and I like to think of this in the sort of idea of films. Often, this is the first 10 to 15 minutes of the films where we get introduced to all the characters. We start to get to know their stories, and something happens that gives us some sort of clarity as to where their lives are, in which direction they're heading. Okay, and all good stories employ this device. You need that exposition, they need that background to be able to relate to the story. The next step is the rising action. So the rising action is development over time. Something changes, something happens. We meet a person, we get a new job, whatever it is in our film. Something happens that makes life either better or worse, and that gives us some a little bit more. It's no longer the exposition. It's no longer the background. This is what is happening right now. We then reach what we call the climax. Now, you may think that's really weird. Why have you got the climax in the middle of the screen and not at the end? Because surely the climax is the end. But actually, in storytelling, your climax is not the end of your story. The climax is the point at which the critical event happens. Something happens, something comes to a head. In the romantic comedy, it's the moment that the guy finds out that the girl is lying, or the girl finds out that the guy is lying, or whatever it is, the thing that forces them apart after everything had been so happy. Or, you know, the moment that someone discovers their identity, the moment in a story where people change, fundamentally change. And in data, this is critical because every story basically follows the pattern of things were going like this, and now they're going like this, and we want to know why. Or things were going like this, we put this measure in place to try and change them, and this is what happened. Those are basically your two storylines in data. And the climax is the point at which something happens. So either you're trying to find out what that climactic point was, or you're trying to find out how that climactic event changed the course of your data. And then we have basically two more steps. The falling action is what the changes were based on the climax. Whatever happened in our climax, whatever direction was changed, then what happens? That is known as our falling action. And then the last thing is the resolution, or the denouement. And in the denouement, basically, we have an answer, something that gives us a sense of understanding and a sense of finality. Okay, so that is your storytelling arc in terms of a movie, in terms of a book or a play or a show. In data storytelling, we follow a very similar arc. The first thing is we provide context. We provide context for data points. We tell people what we're expecting to see, and we explain any concepts that people may not be familiar with. The next thing we do is we look at the rising action, show how any action or an inaction has caused a change. Then the climax, this is the point at which something must happen, okay? And sometimes we get to the story that says, this is the climax point right now, what might happen? And that is a valid story. We don't know what the final steps are going to be, but it's still a valid point to say we need to do something, something has to happen. And then your story will generally be, if we don't do it, this is what will happen. So that's the climax. We then have, of course, our falling action, what will happen if different actions are taken, or what happened after our changes were implemented. And the last thing would be your take-home message. This is what I want you to remember from my talk. Okay, so those are what we call, that is what we call the narrative arc. And you'll see as we go along that we'll start to see that in action with our different stories. So the first demo or example we're going to look at is what we call an exploratory data story. And basically there are two types of data stories. An exploratory data story is one where I give a user the ability to ask their own questions. You can explore, that's where the exploratory comes from, and you can explore my data and try and answer your own questions. And the way we do that, this is very difficult because I can't give you context for your questions. I can't give you, I can't talk about what the rising action or falling action is because I don't know what you're looking at a given time. So we design something like this very differently to the way we design what we're going to look at next, which is what we call an explanatory story, or where we explain something. So let's go here and have a look at just a couple of guidelines for exploratory data stories. There's basically 4 of these. The first one is to choose appropriate visuals. So I've kind of touched on that. The best visual is the one that is most commonly understood and most likely for your audience to be able to connect with. Okay. The next very simple point, and this is a UI concept as well as obviously a storytelling concept, use the same colors to represent the same categories, use color palettes, and to remember to consider visual impairments in people who may not deal with colors in the same way that you do. Our third things is basically to provide people with the ability to filter on those things that they are interested in. So when designing an exploratory story, I have to be able to give you the way to do the exploration. And then the last one is basically to use visual header tooltips. And this is a Power BI thing, so I'm not going to hang on it for too long. But if I have some sort of unfamiliar concept that I think might help by having a more detailed explanation, I can use that to a visual header tooltip to make that easier for you. So let's hop into Power BI now. I think, let's just see what happens there. Here we go. Okay, so let's hop into Power BI like that. Hopefully you should be seeing a report that says distribution of names, exploratory report. And we will sort of try and talk our way through this. So what I've done here is, let me give you some context on our data set first, because this is we said we're gonna get familiar with our data set. What this is it's a data set of all of the births in the USA since 1910. Okay, my data set actually only goes up to 2018. I haven't got the last year's data included yet, but this is an open source data set. It's made available by the government in the USA, and we can use it to start to explore the trends and what has happened over time. So I've put together this very basic report, and there are a couple of things we want to talk about in the report. Okay, so the first one is, let me see if this works. Do you see? No, I don't think that's working. Okay, so we won't do that. Okay, the first thing that we are looking at here is on the top row, I have created a set of filters. So if there's something that you are interested in, like only seeing data from the 1960s, you can always do that and update your report to show that data appropriately. If you're only interested in seeing the 1990s, you could obviously change that from 1990 to 2000, press enter, and there we have a report that is updated as we want. So that's the first thing. We've given you a date filter. I can't remember what the first year was, 1910, I think, because we do need to go back to our full data set for some of the other things. Okay, then of course, I've given you an option to say, hey, I want to view this data just by state. And I'm sure we all know more about the states in the USA now than we did a week and a half ago. So this is something that you might be able to see. And we'll actually tell a story that's a little bit related to that just now. We have the option of talking about the sex of the baby, because this is our data set. It includes whether the baby was given whether the baby was male or female, and how many were born. And then I've added in some other things like you could, hey, I only want to look at baby names that start with the letter M and see how they go. So you could play around with all of that. That is the first set. I've given you a whole variety of different ways to explore this data the way you have. And then what I've done with my data is I've tried to create some visuals for the most common questions I think you're likely to ask. So what questions am I trying to answer here? Basically, how does the birth rate change over time? Or how many babies were born per year? That kind of question. Then the next one, this one, how many unique names were there? So this one shows all the babies. This one shows how many different names there were. Okay, so some years you'll see that over time, there are more and more different names being given to babies each year. We've also got two little graphs here where we talk about the most popular female names and the most popular male names. And that's something that people are often interested. What is the most popular? And not just in this data set, in any data set. And then we have some other things. So here I'm not grouping by names anymore. I'm just grouping by the first letter. So you can see what the most popular first letter is in this specific example. And then we've got this thing. Now this graph is maybe a little bit confusing. Top 10 name percentage, I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's actually, well, I haven't really explained this very well, but it's actually the same visual as that one over there. Percentage of babies with the 10 most popular names. So what that means I'm looking at is I've taken the 10 most popular names in the period that we're looking at. So in this case, in my entire data set. So I've got the 10 most popular male names and the 10 most popular female names. And then I'm saying to myself, what percentage of all babies have one of those 10 names? And this for me is really interesting, that in 1910, 36%, almost 37% of all males had one of 10 names. Okay, so if we click on that, we should be able to click on that data set. It's a pity it doesn't filter, but it actually tells us that 37% of people, 1 in 3 children, had one of 10 names. And that for me is quite an interesting thing, and we might explore that as we go along and to see what's happened, because now if you look in the last year, I have 2018. And specifically, if you look at males, it's dropped all the way down to 9.17%. So now you're only looking at 1 in every 11 kids that have one of those 10 names. So there's a big change over time in terms of those kinds of trends. And that's something we can explore and create into a story. Okay, so I hope you kind of have a vague idea of what's going on in this data set now. I hope you know what it is that we're going to be looking at, because now what we're going to do is we're going to start going into the data set, and we are going to start creating some stories, and these stories, each of them have something that we're going to look back at the end and understand what it is. But let's move on. So I'm going to go back into my slideshow. I'm going to come here, and we're going to talk about some basic data storytelling techniques. And again, we're just going to have a couple of bullet points. And then once we've got those, we'll go back into our demo, and we'll actually use those to build some stories. Okay, so why has my gone away? Okay, so the first thing, now I touched on this in the introduction, but we're going to remove clutter. We're going to get rid of all colors, legends, and axes that don't make the visual clearer or do not add to our experience when viewing the data. So if I go back to that report, there's a couple of examples of this here. So if you look, for instance, at these names, well, the first thing is that I'm guessing, and I really hope, otherwise I've done a poor job here, that you are able to tell from this report that I am representing males as green and females as purple throughout the entire report. Okay, now I don't actually have a legend anywhere that tells you that, but these two graphs on the right-hand side, the 10 most popular male names and 10 most popular female name graphs, by their very sort of, by their design and the fact that one is exclusively green, one is exclusively purple, and the fact that they tell you these are males and these are females, I'm using the power of, or I'm using a pre-attentive attribute to tell you that that's what I'm now doing for the rest of the report. Is green means male, purple means female. There is a reason for that, why I haven't used blue and pink, but I don't really want to, I don't have time to talk about it today. This session could be a lot longer. So, but basically blue and pink are considered problematic representations of male and female because of some of the negative stereotypes that have evolved over time. So this is the accepted color palette around the world for representing male and female in graphical formats, and that's why we're following it, because it is actually sort of a standard or a best practice. Okay, so back to our slideshow. Sorry, that was a little detour. The next thing is repetition. Establish a pattern by using consistent fonts, colors, and sizes. And actually, I kind of just talked about that by explaining in one place what I'm doing with the colors, and then using them the same all the way through. You are able to follow that and understand the meaning of all of my graphs without my having to put a legend on every single one and take up valuable real estate. So that's how we can leverage repetition to ensure that our users get the most out of the graph and we don't waste space unnecessarily. Okay. The next thing, this is a very important thing, show the full picture. Don't be tempted to leave out visuals or information that don't suit the story you want to tell, and highlight known unknowns. So oftentimes we're going to get to a situation where we actually, there is something we can't explain. We know that something happened, but we don't actually have any proof that it happened. It's very important to highlight those for our audience so that they're aware of what it is that you're actually doing, and they don't think that you're trying to mislead them. So we literally, in the next example, we're going to have a look at that exactly. But it's very important to not leave people with the feeling that they may have been misled or they may be being conned. And I think especially now in the age of fake news, in the age of disinformation, this is a really critical sort of ethical behavior to ensure that people are confident and feel trust in your data. And then the last thing, when data is stationary, so when we do have explanatory data, when I know what's going on and I know exactly what you're going to be seeing, having a text explanation is an excellent way to tie the whole story together. Because what I don't want you to do is you and I could look at the same graph and come to two slightly different conclusions. They might both be right. They might both be almost consistent with each other, but you may have noticed something, I may have noticed something different. It's actually important that if I add in a little bit of text, we're both on the same page. You know exactly what it is that I'm thinking and the message that I'm trying to actually put forward with this data. So that is basically our 4 easy tips for basic storytelling techniques and things that we should look out for. So let's hop back into our demo and let's go over here to a new page called Data Stories. And let's start with this first data story. This story is about, well, let me not tell you. The first thing that I did is I took one of the graphs from that explanatory story of ours, or that explanatory report of ours, and I just put it into this report. In this case, this was the chart that showed the number of babies born over time. Okay, because I noticed something interesting, and it was the story that I wanted to focus on, was that if I look at the last 10 to 15 years of this chart, it looks to me like the number of babies that are born is actually decreasing. Now, this doesn't fit into the narrative or the story that we're hearing or that we would assume, which is that population is growing significantly all the time. So this is something I wanted to explore and I wanted to look at and have an idea. Okay, so the first thing we did when we brought this graph into this report is I added a couple of things. And the first thing I did was I took the same graph, I removed the colors that split it between males and females. Why? Because in this specific story, I'm not interested in the split of males and females because, well, to be honest, the split between males and females is round about 50% every year. So if we're looking at this data, it doesn't add anything. All it does is add to our cognitive load, or the amount of information that our brain has to take in and try to work out what it means. So what I've done instead is I've highlighted a different part of the graph, which is the last 30 years, okay, well, since 1980. So almost the last 40 years now. Oh my goodness. And you can see that what I've tried to do is I've used the color. I've used that consistent color in my text to explain what it is that I've highlighted. So since 1980, this is what's going on. And then I have a very basic explanation. The number of babies born per year in the USA has stayed relatively constant since 1980. So that highlighted bit, you can see that it's a relatively consistent number of babies each year. Okay. However, the US population has continued to grow. So you can see this chart at the bottom. We're talking about how the population is growing year on year. And you can hover over that data and understand it. But that is exactly what we're seeing. So the first thing here is that it would be easy. This is the story I was telling about, or what I was talking about earlier in terms of ethical considerations. It would be extremely easy to now slap a couple of pictures of people coming across the border, a couple of pictures of countries' flags, a couple of pictures of whatever it is that you want, and make this into something that people would get upset about, something that I could use to play on emotional feelings and reinforce a story that other people have already started. So this is the kind of thing that when we're talking the stories, we have to be very, very careful about. We have to be very certain that the data we are presenting or the conclusions that we draw from that data are not causing or not false and causing some sort of emotional response, unwarranted emotional response. Because the main reason why the US population per year is increasing despite the number of births staying stable is the fact that the average life expectancy per year is also increasing. So the average life expectancy is in fact increasing over time, as we expect, from basically 50 years, just over 51 years in 1910 to just under 80 years now. That is a 60% increase in the number of people, or the life expectancy. And that has a major effect on the number of people who are alive each year, because now each person who lives to average life expectancy fits into 80 of these bars instead of only fitting into 50. So you can imagine that makes a massive difference. However, it is not the only thing. We do know that there is the movement of people between countries, both through immigration and through emigration. But I don't have that data, and to be honest, I didn't want to go down any sort of rabbit hole and get that data. So what I did was I just put a little explainer on this report that said the increasing life expectancy is certainly a contributing factor. There is no doubt about that. That is a fact, and we can see it. But without the immigration and emigration data, further analysis is required before drawing any conclusions. So here, this is what I was talking about earlier about a known unknown. I know that there are other things that are contributing this fact, or could be contributing to this particular story that I'm telling. And I don't want to be viewed as someone who is presenting false data or who is spreading a narrative that is not in fact. So what I've done is I've actually highlighted the fact that I know there are other factors and I don't have the data for them. So I almost have an incomplete story here. So that's quite important for me personally as someone who's sort of as in terms of my professional integrity, that is, it's a very important thing that I try to always highlight the known unknowns, so that someone who does have some sort of knowledge into that doesn't come and go, ugh, look at this jackass and how he's trying to manipulate the story. Okay, so that's the first story that I basically wanted to talk to. The next one here, let me just have a look at this. Have we gone through these stories yet? No, I don't think so. Okay, so let's go back to our slide deck. Then, and we move on to here. Okay. So the next sort of section here is basically about how to make your. So we've talked about some of the considerations we have when designing a story. The next thing is, how do we now make our visual representation or our presentation of the story more accessible to users and more easy for them to follow? So the first thing is to use titles. Okay, so a lot of the time people will just put in a title, and you saw this in my exploratory reports. I have a report that says something like number of births per year, or number of people per, or percentage of births per letter, initial letter, something like that. Those are not explanatory titles, those are exploratory titles. I'm telling you what you're looking at, you need to explore it. When we start looking at explanatory data, when I know what I'm looking at, you can actually use titles of graphs and charts and visuals to start to reinforce the message of that visual. So if we look at that specific, if we go back into our demo and we look at this, you can see that these two charts have visual headings, titles, that actually explain what you are seeing. The number of unique names has increased over time, very easy to understand, and fewer people have one of the 10 most popular names over time. Cool. So those two, immediately you read those titles and you know what you're looking at. You know what the graph is representing, and you can sort of follow through that. Okay, so that's the first thing. Emphasize your story using your titles. The next one here, inspired by the Pirates of the Caribbean. The code is more like guidelines rather than rules. When sometimes in certain scenarios, a best practice might say you should do one thing. But when you actually explore the data and try to play with it, you find that it doesn't make sense. The representation that you're looking at maybe isn't as clear. So an example of this would be, if you are representing geographic data, the best practice for any geographic data is to represent it on a map, because it gives you a lot of perspective of the things you want to be looking at. So it gives you proximity to other areas, it gives you relative size, it gives you lots of things that you may want to look at. But if I add in two maps here to show you this data, if you look at those two maps, they tell you almost nothing. Okay, those two maps, yeah, they're slightly, I mean, again, we all kind of have a vague idea of what America looks like now. The slightly darker concentrations amongst more conservative states, slightly lighter concentrations amongst more liberal or democratic states, but that doesn't really tell me anything that I want to see. It's very difficult for me to compare a state like Arizona between these two charts. It's very difficult for me to compare population. There's a lot of things that it makes this difficult. So in this specific case, even though the best practice would be to represent data by graphically, I've decided here to represent it more visually in a table. And interestingly here, you now start to see, because this is ordered in a descending order by the number of, by the overall population of the top 10 most popular names. And you actually see that both Rhode Island and DC are on the East Coast and are actually not conservative areas at all. They're generally considered fairly liberal areas. So even even in our visuals there, the map kind of lied to us because it was so difficult to tell the data apart because the differences are so small. So it's in this specific case, even though we have a best practice or a guideline, it makes more sense to represent it slightly differently. And just while we're on this sort of visual, while we go along, there are some tips here in terms of how to create better tables. And what the most important thing really in this visual is this use of what we call, well, it's not really spark lines, but bar charts within a visual or data bars within a visual that allow us to represent the data both graphically and in a text format. Okay, and you can go down through it and sort of see how that works. And we also allow people, this is also very important, to allow our users to interact with our data. I want to see it rather by the percentage of males rather than the overall percentage or even the percentage of females. Give my users different ways to interact with the data and to understand from their point of view what they're looking at. Okay, so that's another thing just in terms of the guidelines are guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules. And then we'll go on here. Positioning, I've just talked about that. So think about how we position our visuals. So in that case, I had the male and the female, those data bars actually next to each other rather than apart. So you can see you can actually see the movement between them. And then the last thing is highlighting key points. It provides immediate focal points. Sorry, let's go back to there so I can show you what that means. If I go here, you can see that some of my text now has some very clear highlights of what it is that I want you to know from it. So there was a fairly steady increase in the number of unique names. Since 2008, that trend is reversing. And then the one at the bottom, historically, the concentration of most popular names has been more than twice as large in men. And you can see that in the visual. In our visual, we have 32% and versus 14%. It's really just over twice, or around about twice as much. But in 2009, for the first time, and this is now in the visual above us, women had a higher percentage of babies with the 10 most popular names than men for a single year. And I've noticed this in my personal friendship group, that a large number of my friends who have had children have settled on very popular names at the moment for their female children, for their girls, but less popular names for their boys. So there are lots of Olivias, Isabellas, and other what other names? I can't think what they are right now. We could go and explore them, but I know Olivia and Isabella are number 1 and 2 at the moment in terms of most popular female names. And that I've noticed that within my friendship group as well. So this is something that is a trend to watch out for as we go along. Okay, so we've now basically done 2 sections. We've talked about how do we create decent looking reports, and also how do we tell our stories ethically and in a good way. So now we're going to just go a little bit deeper into the good-looking reports type of idea, and we're going to talk about 4 points here. We're going to look at quickly some tooltips. I'm not going to talk through them. You all know what a tooltip is. We're going to talk about moving data. Now, moving data is something that has gotten a lot more popular recently. I'm sure that you have seen all of these running bar charts on social media and on various presentations and things, how total number of whatever, the richest person in the world, and how it changes over time, and you see the people move. All of these kinds of things. It's becoming a very popular way to represent data, and I really like it, especially when talking to executives about how things are changing over time. I find it much easier to visualize that in a moving chart than on a static chart. So we'll have a look at that. The next one is using color as a pre-attentive attribute. Actually, not really going to talk about that because we've touched on it. Color is we looked at it when I had the orange highlighting on the first step, but a pre-attentive attribute basically means something that catches your eye immediately when you look at a graph, or look at a report or a story. So we can use lots of things for pre-attentive attributes. We can use color, we can use size, we can use boldness, we can use intensity, we can use spacing. There's loads of different ways that you can actually create these pre-attentive attributes, but we can, color is the most noticeable and obvious of those. And then the last one is an emotional connection. So how do we create an emotional connection with our users, and how do we make them remember the story in the best way? And hopefully we're going to look at a story just now, and hopefully you guys are going to have an emotional connection to it. I know I have an emotional connection to this story, so if you don't, I'm sorry. It means that you're either you're just so young that it makes me sad, or you missed out on wonderful times while growing up. So actually, I don't think we need to worry about this story. Sorry, let me just check it quickly. So this is the one where I wanted to talk about color. This is a fairly complicated visual. Basically, the story here is about how in English we have a certain distribution of letters. So if I went and got a dictionary and basically found out what the first letter of each word was. I didn't actually physically do this. There's an online dictionary where you can just scrub it. So I did that. I got all the words in the English language and worked out what the percentage of each word was, or each initial was there, first letter. And then we looked at baby names and the percentage of how many babies had the first letter, and then compared the two. That's what we do in scatter charts. We compare two numeric values against each other, and you can see that this diagonal line would be if you had the same number or the same percentage, relatively speaking, between the dictionary and the baby names. And you can see here that certain letters like J, K, M, and A are very much overperforming, whereas certain letters like U and P are very much underperforming. So there's a couple of things that we could look at here. So I talked about how we use tooltips. Now, there is a lot of data going on here. This is could be a little bit confusing. So one of the things I did was I added in this tooltip that if you hovered over it, it'll actually tell you what's going on here. So what that means is, in English, there are 2,840 odd words that start with the letter J. That is 0.77% of all words in English. Over time, there have been 42 million babies born whose name started with the letter J. That is just under 13.5% of all babies born in our data set. This is obviously a massive discrepancy between that. Additionally, there are, but one of the things that you may think is, oh yeah, but there's like 3 or 4 popular names with a J, like James, John, Jacques, Jackie type of thing. If you take those names out, surely that you don't get the same performance. And that is correct. If you only count each name once, so if we only talk about the number of unique names, there are only 2,400 unique names that start with the letter J, and that only is just above 7.5% of the total number of unique names of all time. So as I said, this is a lot of data. This is quite difficult to communicate, and this is something that you may have to explain to a user. But what I've tried to do is made it as easy as possible so that you can hover over a data point and get more information. Again here, P 35,000 words, but only 550 unique names. Massive differences between the expected and the sort of value. So what do we do then to understand this? Well, we start to sorry, I don't know why the filter pane keeps showing. We start to look at why, or we first give a premise. The percentage of unique names is largely consistent with the percentage of English words.
Hey,
then we talk, yeah.
I'm so sorry. I think we have lost you a little bit. We are stuck on the additional design tools slide.
Sorry, my bad. I didn't go back into there we are. You should have that now. I'm so sorry. Okay, now I wish I'd known earlier. So what I was talking about, let me just go back a step. What I was actually showing was if you hover over a data point here, we get these extra data points. These are the ones I was talking through. I'm not going to talk through them again. But basically, on this scatter chart, we are, it's a bit difficult to understand exactly what's going on. So what I've done is I've created these tooltips, which hopefully make it easier for a user to see. Okay, so that's basically what I was talking about. Apologies for not switching screens. So in terms of my conclusion here, I have, and this is quite an interesting thing, the notable overrepresentation in English are J, K, Y, and Z. And the prevalence of J and Y are very interesting because they talk about how much the influence of the Hebrew language and the Christian faith have had over the historical naming of children. So if you look at the 10 most popular names, most of them come from the Christian faith. They're biblical names. You're talking about James, John. I mean, we could go back and look at them, but these are the ones. Paul, Matthew. All of these are biblical names, and almost all of them, specifically the ones that start with J and with Y, are influenced by Hebrew, being the original language in which the Bible was written. So that's quite an interesting thing, where a religion or another language has an influence on the distribution of names in a very predominantly English-speaking country, and then obviously our underrepresented letters, U and P, are the two biggest ones. You can see that on this graph. U and P are very underrepresented, and that is, I have no data to back this up, but I suspect that what's going on here is that U and P are the two most common prefixes, or prefixes that start with U or P are the most common in English, and I suspect that those prefixes skew the data in the dictionary rather than it being a particularly popular letter. So where you have words like underdone, undercooked, and you start getting loads and loads of words that start with a U, but actually, words that start with a U that aren't composite words, that don't have a prefix, are much, much fewer. So that's probably the explanation there. Again, I don't have any data, but that was my assumption based on the research that I could find. Okay, so that's to do with, in terms of the 2 points here, that I really wanted to talk about. The one was the tooltips. The other was using color as a pre-attentive attribute. So all the things that here are above are green. All the things that are here are orange. If I did this again, I would probably, and I should probably next time I do this presentation, change that. I've already formed an emotional connection or a cognitive connection between green and male in your brains with all the things we've been talking about. So it's probably not actually a good idea for me to have green here representing something else in terms of overrepresentation. So I should actually probably change that to a blue or another color that I haven't already used, because green and purple have been very strongly associated so far with male versus female. So that's something, when I look at my report, I suddenly realized, okay, that's something I could do better. Okay, so we talked about that. Then the next thing I talked about was the moving data example. Why do I not? Oh, it's just loading. Sorry, it's a bit slow. So here I have an example of moving data, and what this is showing babies whose names have changed over time, or names that have changed over time from being male names to female names, or from female names to male names, or have varied over time. So there are some rules that are on the right-hand side here of how I included a name, what makes the names fall into my data set, and then we have the actual visual. So just as an example, this is what it would look like. So you could see some names like Terry. I'm sure we all know male and female Terrys, Leslies. This one here, Jean, is an interesting example because in English, that Jean is Jean. Very, very female, very traditional English name. But over time, I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I don't have control over that. You will see that over time, some of these names like Jean move to this side, I'm not 100% certain, but I think it's this thing in the very bottom right-hand corner. It's the purple dot in the very bottom right-hand corner, because that name has become surpassed. Jean as an English, as a female name, has really fallen out of favor. But Jean, the French name Jean, which is spelt exactly the same, has become much more popular. So I'm pretty sure that name there is almost now entirely male. And there's some interesting ones that you may not have thought about, that you may not have realized over time. Like I know Lauren was somewhere here, somewhere in the 1960s. In the 1950s, Lauren switched from being a male name to a female name. I don't know. There, you can see it. So Lauren, I've just sort of seen it, but it moves over time. Also, Kerry here in the bottom, and Kelly. We have a number of names that you may think of. There's Kelly there. And you can see that over time it's moved, and Kerry also. So there are some interesting changes that have happened over time. And as we look into each one, we can start to, a lot of the times you can start to understand what happened with them. So let's do that. Let's look at one specific example. Where's this one? It's called Searching for Angels. That's the one. Okay. So I'm not going to step through this report like I have with some of the other reports. I just thought I'd show a whole data story all at once. So what's happening here is, firstly, we can see that the name Angel has, or that the Angel, A-N-G-E-L, has really increased in popularity up until sort of 2006, and has then decreased quite a lot. So that's the first thing. Then we can see a total number of babies. Then the interesting thing for me is this gender variance. So what I've done here is per state, I've said of all the babies named Angel who are born, how many of them were male and how many of them were female, and then I've assigned a percentage to that. So for instance, in Washington State, 71% of all babies born with the name Angel were male. And in West Virginia, 100% of all babies born with the name Angel were female. So there's a big discrepancy or variation between these states. And based on, again, sort of some knowledge of the US and what's going on there, what I did was I went and found out where people speak Spanish, because I had an inkling that Angel is not actually a very popular female name in English. You know, I thought maybe you would find some in the Bible Belt, in the middle Midwest of America here, or not the sort of that area. You can see my mouse, yes, of America. I thought I would find some there, but I also thought that the Spanish name Angel is a very popular male name, and you can see a couple of examples like Angel de Maria, who is a footballer. And obviously Angel from Buffy, but you've got various examples of these. But based on the research I could do and the way I could look it up, there's a massive correlation between whether somebody who is born and given that name Angel, there's a massive correlation between whether they would be male or female based on whether the state is more dominantly Spanish speaking or not, or the percentage of Spanish speakers in the state versus not. So these states towards the southern border, obviously more Spanish speaking individuals, and very strongly correlated to number of male angels versus these other states in the middle where you don't. So there's always this information that we can add on. We can always dig deeper and find our stories by giving them context and by sort of trying to find the correlations, trying to find the stories. Now, again, I have no proof that any of this is true, but I've gone and looked at data, and it logically makes sense to me that this is what is the situation here that's happening. Okay, so that's basically all of the serious stuff. We've got one fun thing now, really, I hope, to talk through, and that is what we call the effects of pop culture. Okay, oops, we don't want to start with Ross. We're going to talk about Friends. No, actually, before we talk about Friends, let's talk about a couple of other things. Let us talk about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, massive hit. Damn it, one of my internet links is broken. Somebody has taken a picture away. I apologize. Anyway, I went and found three names from Game of Thrones, and these are Khaleesi, Arya, and Daenerys. Sorry, just so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about, because you can't see the pictures. But so if I look at Khaleesi literally never appeared in America until the year 2011. No one had ever been named Khaleesi. And now, 2018, 517 girls were born and named Khaleesi. So this is clearly an influence of pop culture. This is, I mean, there is no other explanation. In fact, if you go and research it, no one had ever seen that formation of letters as a word before George R.R. Martin actually published the first Game of Thrones book. So this was an entirely new formation of letters or word, and it was then, and now it has become a name. Not huge. I mean, 500 babies is not a massive number, but it's a lot more than zero. So that's an interesting one. Arya, very similar. I mean, Arya is a name that has been recognized since sort of 1982 was the first time that we had five Aryas. But again, it's now up to a point where in 2018 we had 2,500 Aryas, and it became it's actually in the top 300 most popular names in America at the moment in terms of per year. It is just under 300th most popular. And then another one, Daenerys, also a name that never had existed, also a word that never existed before the Game of Thrones came along. And we've got up to 95, almost 100 babies born in 2018 and given that name. So it's clear that pop culture and the things that we're experiencing and viewing and that can influence the names of babies. Oh, our picture did arrive eventually. So that's a interest for me. That's a very interesting thing. But I want to tell you a story about Friends. Friends was a cultural phenomenon. I think everyone can agree that Friends like really influenced the world, and there's a load of things that have been influenced by it. From Rachel's haircut to how you're doing to oh my God and various things like that. But I wanted to look at what influence the names of the characters had on the world. So Phoebe was a fairly popular. I mean, it was a name that appeared, but it was relatively unpopular. I don't think anyone can sort of think that is a popular name. In the 10 years that Friends was on TV, Phoebe really increased quite a lot, and over time it is continued to increase. So it's still not a massive number of babies. In fact, it's 1,100 was the most Phoebes ever born in a year in the US. So it's not a massively popular name, but Friends definitely had an influence. You can see that upward curve. Okay, Joey is a bit of a difficult one, because there's so many variations, and I can't look at Joe and Joseph and Joey. So this one, a little bit difficult to tell the story, but it doesn't really seem as though it had much of an influence. Certainly not people actually physically named Joey. So it doesn't seem like we have it. So we don't really have a story there. This is one that I expected to have an influence, and I think it's quite clear from the graph that it does. The 10 years in which Friends was on TV are 9 of the highest years in terms of when babies named Chandler were born across the US. And surprisingly, Chandler is a more popular name than Phoebe. Remember, if we looked at our absolute numbers, Phoebe was sitting at about 1,100 as its maximum. Chandler up to 2,800 just after he married Monica. So, you know, good things. Friends did good things for the names Chandler. Okay. The last, I'm deliberately doing this in this order. So Monica, bit of an interesting one here because this seems to have had the opposite effect. Although if we look at the trend, Monica was definitely decreasing before Friends started, from a peak of sort of 1979, definitely a big decrease over time. And I read somewhere, although I haven't ever been able to find it, that they actually chose it as a name for the character because of the fact that Monica had been viewed in the early 1990s and just before that, Monica was viewed as a bit of an annoying name. You know how sometimes names get like stigmas, and this Monica was actually viewed as like that annoying person who is super uptight and not no fun, and they wanted to develop the character that way, and then obviously the show was much more popular than they thought, so they had to change that in a way. But she still had some of those characteristics, and it's almost that name was chosen because of the negative connotation or the slight negative connotations. But again, still more popular than both Phoebe and Chandler, although not so much anymore. But at the start of Friends, certainly much more popular than those two. Okay, and then the final thing. I want to talk to you about Ross and Rachel. Okay, and let's look at the word at Ross. So Ross, it's a fairly popular name going into Friends, but it was declining. It was declining sharply as the season started. So season 1, Ross, annoying character. Season 2, Ross and Rachel get together, massive spike, like huge spike in the number of babies named Ross. Season 3, they're still together. Everything going well, lots of babies named Ross. Season 4, they break up and everything goes to hell. Like that name has fallen off a cliff. People just don't name their kid Ross anymore. So if you really wanted to name your kid Ross and you're upset that it's not a popular name anymore, I feel like you can blame Warner Brothers and the writers of Friends, because they seem to have done him a very big disservice by breaking him and Rachel up. But what you would expect then is maybe Rachel, you know, had the opposite effect. She probably got more popular. But you'd be wrong. You'd be wrong. Ross and Rachel get together. Ross and Rachel are happy. Ross and Rachel break up and everything falls off a cliff. So in terms of those two names, that moment in TV history where they broke up with each other is a pivotal moment, well, in my mind anyway, of how many people actually are willing to name their children after them because of what happened there. And I think most people will agree that if you talk about Ross or Rachel without any context, people will default to thinking about Friends. And that's why I think that these names have now taken this connotation, because there's such a big, well, there were so many things that happened in that relationship, which people are like, oh my goodness, I don't want to name my child after that. So that really is the last of my data stories. I hope as I said, that's a very emotional story for me, or I have an emotional connection to it at least. And I hope that in some ways you do too, and you can understand how you can tell a story using just data. Literally, all I've done here is taken some data out of a US government database and plotted it on a graph and then mixed it with the years that a TV show was on screen. And you can make a story. And I guarantee you that if you take nothing else out of this talk, the one thing you will remember is that Ross and Rachel breaking up in Friends was a pivotal moment in the trajectory of those two names in America. And for me, that is the power of a great data story. And that is exactly what we strive for in all the work we do whenever we communicate data to an audience and anytime that we try to present our data and our findings to someone, a user group. So thank you very much for tuning in. I think that's everything. Let me just go back to my presentation and see if it dies. Yeah, there we go. End of slideshow. So let's go back to the Four Seasons, because that's a great place to start. And we started at the Four Seasons. We're going to end here at the Four Seasons. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to hand back to Nene now. And thanks for having me.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for actually doing this. That was awesome. Thanks so much, James. Now I want pizza, but I mean, I've also learned a lot about data stories. So thanks so much for both of those. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through. So I'm just going to scroll up and see if we can grab them. You are also welcome to jump into the chat and take a look with us. So I want to just up to some of those, but it's been a very helpful one. If you guys have any further questions while we start working with them, please, the link below is there. So let's start with Phil. So Phil asked, would it help to cite the sources of your data as well, referring to your comment about bad sources and fake news, or how do you work that into your presentation without creating too much clutter?
So I hope you could actually see that on every page that I had, I did actually have the sources of the data. So I'm gonna steal the screen back, and then
go for it. Go for it.
How do I do that? Wait.
Let's just send you live.
Quick picture. No, that's fine. I'm here. Okay. So if you look at, let's just go to one of these stories.
I think you are not visible just yet, James.
Okay, it's just, I can see I'm going live. Something's happening.
No, Microsoft Live has a few delays. Sorry about that, guys. It seems to be acting up a little bit on us.
Let me just check actually which. I need to be in Power BI. I see what the problem. Sorry, that's my mistake. Okay, am I live? No, I'm still not live.
Not as yet. Sorry, that seems a bit odd. Okay. I think you need to have your camera on to make you live again, unfortunately.
I did. I don't know what happened. Okay, now I can see.
Okay, there we are. We got it.
Cool. Sorry about that. So if you look at the bottom of this report, there is a hyperlink to the actual data where I've used multiple data sets. I have tried, in terms of ethical data storing, I often try and keep my sources clear so that if anyone wants to dispute the things I'm showing, I can actually send them to the links and say, here are these are the sources, this is where the data came from. And yeah, I think in terms of, I think that is the correct way afterwards. I see, Phil says he did see that after he posted the question. Sorry, yeah, all good?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
I saw that Wayne also asked the question about Donald and how Donald has been affected. So let's have a look there quickly. See if we can find it. We do have a way to do this in our report. Donald. Just let it load. And you can't really say it's been affected because it actually was so low already by the time he came around. It's difficult to see. Very popular name towards the 1930s, 1934, middle of the war. Oh no, early, yeah, a couple of years before the wars. I don't know what happened. I don't have any insight into what happened there, but it doesn't appear that the Trump had anything to do with it. Maybe easier to see if Barack had any influence. Not really either. People didn't really name their kids after him. So, you know. We can play with this data and see, but doesn't seem to be any correlation there. Okay, sorry, I stole that question from you. Any others?
No, go for it, go for it. So there's one from Alex as well. He basically says, a typical developer problem is showing feedback on actions, e.g. indicating that the interface has changed. A lot of the work you're talking about here shows how you could make the data more visible, but how would you typically indicate that the state of the data has been updated? For example, if nothing actually changes, how do you indicate that in your query, or do you that your query didn't just hang and nothing changed?
That's a bit of a tough one. You'd have to sort of work through it in terms of an exact example. But what I like to do in terms of if you're reporting on statuses and things, I like to use the most neutral color possible to indicate that nothing has changed. So you will have noticed in my reports that there's a lot of grays, dark grays, light grays. and that kind of thing. Neutral colors is how I would generally show that something has not, or is either not in focus or not changing. So let's go back to this specific example and go forward a couple of steps. So that the reason I've chosen that gray or dark gray in this case in this specific report is because of the fact that that data is not being highlighted. It's not actually the focus of what we're talking about. I want it to be there. I want you to be able to see the trends before that. But the focus is that orange part. And that's why we're leveraging what I was talking about earlier about pre-attentive attributes. That's how we leverage them and use them. This is the bit that I'm focusing on. And you could probably do the same thing in terms of talking about when statuses have changed or when data has been updated, and show that, you know, everything that's in a gray or a very neutral color is static or unchanged, and things that have highlights have moved in either direction. And there you can also use a positive and a negative color. Green and red are generally not a good combination, so maybe a blue and a red or something like that to indicate in which direction you've moved. That's the kind of thing I would be looking at.
Awesome. Guys, it looks like we've answered all of the questions. If there's anybody that we missed, please feel free to ping us. We'll get through them. I think from my side, something that I did want to ask is, when you are putting together your slideshows, do you consider, for example, visually impaired people, especially if you're presenting to a big group? So, for example, putting red and green together may be a bit tricky for some people. How do you approach that, or is that a consideration that you have?
I do. I've gotten better over time at trying to consider that kind of stuff. I still make lots of mistakes. In terms of presentations, I often use color, and I hardly ever use colors to have meaning. So you'll see. Let me just pop back into my presentation quickly and switch screens like that. So if you look at this slide, for instance, there are colors, and I'm using color as a pre-attentive attribute by linking the piece of text to the actual image by using the same color in the heading. So in this case, I'm leveraging two pre-attentive attributes. I'm using the position. Logically, the position actually also tells you which image it's related to, but the color itself has no significance. The color here is more just for aesthetic value. And on everything, I've tried to also use an icon. So even if someone were visually impaired and maybe had a type of visual impairment here, they should still be able to tell the difference by the use of color, the consistent shading between the color and the graphic and the image, and the positioning. I shouldn't lose anything. So that is, yes, there's a consideration there, but it's not. I'm also, like I say, I'm not always the best. There's a excellent lady on Twitter. Her name is Megan Longoria. She talks a lot about accessible design, and I've learned a lot from her, and I'm getting better, I think. But I still got a bit of a way to go to be really, really good. But things like changing the colors, where I used to have blue and pink, that is not necessarily an accessibility thing, but that was a moral, ethical, I don't know what you want to call it, sort of type of decision. And that's so I think we all get better as we do things more and more. And so this specific slide deck that I've used and the colors in them are actually a corporate palette, which was designed to be very, very accessible. So most of the colors should be pretty good.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, me again. Thank you so much for watching with us. That was really interesting. Thank you, Arthur and James, for putting together these amazing talks. I know I learned a lot. Heaven knows Blazor is really technically savvy. And people actually name their kids Khaleesi. Who knew that? The next talks will be on Wednesday, the 25th of November 2020 at 1 o'clock. Join us for a talk about magic and innovation from two of our very own Darielites. If you've got questions about this session, pop them in the comments below and we will get to them. Otherwise, we'll see you guys next time, and thank you again for joining us. Goodbye for now.